Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are in chapter 12 here, second of the three cardiovascular chapters. So we're going to be talking here about the heart. Let's start with some functions of the heart, which you can see written there in red. We have generation of blood pressure, routing of blood, ensuring the one-way flow of blood, and helping regulate blood supply. I think you'll notice a common theme there. Of course, one of the main things that the heart does is to pump blood. The blood moves through the heart and around through the rest of the body. So we'll kind of be encountering some of these as we go along more specifically. Um, when we study really any kind of system, we have to keep in mind that individual organs that are part of these systems are always working together. And so, we had our little coverage of blood in the previous chapter. Now we have the heart, but we can't ignore kind of where we're going with that, which is the peripheral blood vessels, which ultimately that's where the blood is going. Um, So let's see, I'm just trying to see if there's anything here that we will not be mentioning later on. I don't really think so. Maybe number 4. I don't talk too much about regulation specifically, but blood supply, we're talking there about the how much blood is actually in circulation in the body, and that is dependent upon how quickly the heart contracts or pumps really. So that's the rate. You would be able to measure your heart rate by taking your pulse. It's measured in beats per minute. And the force of contraction, because the heart is a muscle, and depending upon how strongly it contracts, so if it really kind of squeezes that blood out forcefully, then that's going to equate to a larger amount of blood actually leaving the heart and going into circulation. And that really ties into some of the other things as well, like blood pressure, because the heart is actually what kind of starts the movement of the blood through the circulatory system. Okay, so if we take a look at just kind of an overall view of the thoracic cavity, you can see, I'm sure many of you, all of you, know where your heart is located. It's about the size of a closed fist, sorry. And it is a muscle, so like any muscles where you can work those muscles and make them a little bit bigger and stronger, the heart is no different. And so it enlarges to some extent when a person is active. And there is a little bit of atrophy or shrinkage of the heart later on in life. So if you look at the picture there, and you'll see the lungs kind of off to the side, you'll see the heart right there in the middle. The part that's sticking up at the top there, the trachea and the larynx, that's part of the respiratory system, which we'll get to. But using those two things, the trachea especially, as a landmark, if you draw kind of an imaginary line vertically through the thoracic cavity, that imaginary line or that area is known as the mediastinum. And so the heart, you can see, is I wouldn't say exactly in the middle. There's not perfect symmetry there, but it lies within that location. The base of the heart is actually considered to be the top part of the heart, where you can see kind of the blue area, and then the apex is the bottom part. If you look at the heart itself, kind of down towards the right-hand corner, you'll notice that it sort of comes to a point, and that's known as the apex. So the base is the superior, apex is inferior, top and bottom, and then also the way that the heart sits in in its little space there is such that it almost, if you can imagine it, reclining a little bit, so that the base is a little bit more posterior. The top portion is a little more posterior than the apex. So the apex tends to be a little bit more points towards the front of the body. So here we have just the heart itself. You can see some of the surface structures. All that red and blue that you might notice at the top, those are blood vessels. So we're going to be learning some of those by name as well. The heart is wrapped in a double layered sheath called a pericardium. And if you look at the heart itself, you'll notice this, there's a probably more noticeable is the blue line that seems to go all the way around it. But if you look very closely at the surface itself of the heart, you'll see a red line. Okay, so there's the red line that goes around the surface of the heart. Then there's a white space, and then you'll see the blue line. That's the pericardium. Actually, the red and the blue together make up the pericardium. So the red layer, which is adheres to the heart, is called the visceral layer, and then the layer that is a little bit more removed from the heart surface is the parietal layer. That's the blue one. Now the white space in between those two layers is exactly what I've been calling it. It's a space, but it is filled with a fluid called pericardial fluid, and that does help protect the heart, kind of cushion it all the way around. The wall of the heart is comprised of cardiac muscle cells, so we do refer to the heart as a muscle. This is, we kind of, I think before talked about the 3 different muscle types: skeletal, smooth, and then here's the cardiac. The heart is also broken up into 4 compartments inside, what we call chambers. The 2 on top are known as atria, and the 2 on the bottom are the ventricles. We'll take an inside look at all of this in just a minute. Also inside of the heart are structures called valves, and in the first slide that I showed you, when we looked at some of the functions of the heart, we mentioned that the heart ensures that blood flows in one direction, and part of the parts of the heart that are kind of responsible for that are these valves, because the blood is only able to pass through the valve one way but not the other. So we'll have to open this up in order to see the locations of the 2 sets of valves. We have the atrioventricular and the semilunar valves, and there are 2 of each type. Here you'll see a flow chart which is showing us the route of blood flow through the heart. I'm going to show you an illustration that will go along with this next, but really it's just kind of a listing of the order of structures that the blood is going to pass through, or yeah, really kind of through everything, but not everything is the same type of structure. So we may be talking in some cases about a chamber within a heart, or a blood vessel, or actually even a valve. You'll notice 3 different colors in this diagram. The blue and the red, which we're going to have to kind of get used to even when we look at illustrations or models of the heart. A lot of times, you know, blue and red with respect to blood vessels, people think automatically that red indicates arteries and blue indicate veins, and I won't say that that's not true at all, but that is not always the case. It's not 100% accurate. Really what the blue and the red are representing is what is flowing through those vesicles, or sorry, the vessels, in terms of the blood. The blue indicates blood that does not have oxygen in it, or is, you know, at least low in oxygen. We call that deoxygenated blood. Red indicates oxygenated blood, okay, oxygen-rich blood. And then the yellow, I'll point out, that's some, those are some kind of detours in circulation that feed the lungs and the heart itself. So why don't we start with number 1 in the upper left-hand corner, and we'll go through this, and then, like I said, I'll kind of show you in the picture. You can follow the arrows showing the same thing in more of an illustration form. So in number 1, and I know we haven't gone over the specific blood vessels yet. Unfortunately, we just missed being able to cover this while we were still in class. But there are a couple of major, these are going to be pretty much 2 of the biggest veins in the entire body. They're called the vena cavae. There's a superior one and an inferior one. One of the things to keep in mind here are that veins bring blood to the heart, and arteries bring blood away from the heart. So these, the superior vena cava comes up from the top, basically drains everything in the head and the neck area above the heart, and then the inferior vena cava is bringing blood up from everything below the heart. Okay, then we take that, I'm going to go off to the right from there, and we hit the right atrium. So Now we're in the heart itself. So these two large veins, the vena cavae, they drain into the right atrium. Then we go through a valve, the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. Okay, and the ventricle is the bottom portion. So far we're still on the right side of the heart. Then we're going to take, blood is going to flow through another set of valves called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Pulmonary refers to lungs. And so this blood right now is going to the lungs. Through the pulmonary semilunar valve, the blood will leave through another pretty large vein called the pulmonary trunk. And I'm sorry, at this point actually it's an artery. The pulmonary trunk, and finally then the pulmonary arteries. And this is kind of where things get a little bit backwards, where the blue and red rule don't quite equate to just arteries and veins. The pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, as that name suggests, those are both arteries. Now you'll see them in blue, and that is because the blood that is flowing through those arteries is deoxygenated. The blood has not yet gone to the lungs, it's on its way. So that's why it doesn't have oxygen. All right, so the pulmonary arteries, and there are actually going to be two sets of pulmonary arteries, one that goes off to the left lung and one that goes off to the right lung. Then we're going to go down, we're in the top right-hand corner, we're going to go down and we hit a yellow box that says lung tissue. Okay, and so this is pulmonary circulation. Now, a couple things are happening here with the lung tissue. The first thing is going to be, and you'll notice if we kind of fast forward ahead a little bit, after lung tissue going down one more box, now we're in the red or the pink zone of the diagram. And so it seems that we're at the kind of crossover point where we have the deoxygenated blood finally becoming oxygenated. And that's exactly what is happening in the lungs. So in the lungs, your deoxygenated blood is coming in through the pulmonary arteries, going to the lungs where oxygen is picked up, carbon dioxide is dropped off, we get rid of the CO2, and the oxygen now is in the blood. Okay, now it's up to the heart to pump that oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. So the way that that blood is going to return to the heart is through the pulmonary veins. Now here again, pulmonary veins, they are veins, but you'll see that we're in the red zone because these pulmonary veins are now carrying blood that is pretty rich in oxygen because that blood has just visited the lungs and we just picked up a whole bunch of oxygen in the lungs. Those veins then drain into the left atrium, top portion of the heart on the left side, move through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, through another set of valves called the aortic semilunar valves. And the aortic, that term refers to the largest artery in the body, which is called the aorta. And so by now the blood is getting ready to leave the heart and be pumped into circulation in general. Through the valves, through the aorta, and then we kind of reach a little bit of a crowded spot on the left-hand side of the diagram. There are some arrows that go up, and then there's an arrow that kind of continues on a little bit. I'm talking about right from the aorta. There's an arrow that kind of continues on to the left a little bit, and then eventually joins the beginning of the loop. So let's take that little detour first. So from the aorta, if we go straight up from the aorta, you'll see the coronary arteries. Okay, coronary refers to heart. So these are the arteries that are actually supplying the heart itself with blood. We don't want to forget that even though it's the job of the heart to generate the blood supply that is going to all of our body tissues, the heart itself is also an organ that requires just the same stuff. Requires oxygen and glucose and a blood supply of its own. So that little portion, that little premature turn there is coronary circulation. So those are the arteries that are actually going to feed the heart as an organ. Okay, then similarly, so the heart tissue is shown in yellow. Okay, and then the deoxygenated blood, after the heart has taken the oxygen out of the blood, that deoxygenated blood eventually makes it back to the right atrium. Okay, and then we're kind of on that pathway again. Now, if we go back down to the aorta where the number 8 is, and we go off to the left and take that slightly longer route, you'll see where it says there's another yellow box that says body tissue, systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is just circulation throughout the rest of the body. That's going to be everything above the heart, everything below, all of the organs and tissues and so forth. And so there's quite a lot of blood leaving at that point from the left atrium through the aorta and being circulated systemically. But eventually, all of that blood, after the tissues have pulled the oxygen from the blood, okay, now we're back to number 1, and you'll see that that blood, once again, we're blue, so that blood is not oxygenated, okay, because the tissues has already taken that oxygen out of the blood. So now we gotta send the blood back to the heart, which comes in through the vena cava once again, and then we're going to go to the lungs, just like we did before, get more oxygen, and then send that oxygenated blood out the same way. So here is an illustration of what I just described. I know there's a lot going on here, and unfortunately I can't figure out a way to point to things and have you actually see it while I'm going through. So I'll just try to maybe use some of those numbers that are printed on there. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that we're looking at a section of the heart, and it's facing us. So when I refer to, for example, the left side of the heart, that would actually be on the right side of the picture, if that makes sense. Okay, it's as if this person whose heart it is standing there facing you, and you're looking at what's inside. It's one of those backwards things. So the right side of the heart is going to be on the left hand of the side of the picture. Okay, so on the left side, let's see. All right, I guess we can kind of follow the numbers once again. If we look at number 1, all right, that chamber is the right atrium, and you can kind of follow the leader lines as well to see some of these labels. You'll see the 2 big blue tubes, one coming up from the bottom, one coming down from the top, and those are the vena cavae, which are draining deoxygenated blood into that right atrium. And then we just want to kind of follow those white arrows for a little while. The first white arrow that's pointing down into the chamber number 2 is going through that that tricuspid valve. Okay, and then from the chamber number 2, the ventricle, I think, is represented by the number 2. So that's that blue space down at the bottom. And then the heart goes up through the big blue vessel that you see right in the middle of the heart, going straight up vertically where number 3 is. And that's going to be your pulmonary trunk. Those little flaps, those little white flaps that you see just below the number 3, those are the pulmonary semilunar valves. Okay, that's going to make sure that that blood is only going from the right ventricle up and not coming back down into that ventricle. So follow number 3 up, and then you'll see the 2 arrows, one going to the left, one going to the right. So that's where those pulmonary veins split off. And you can just imagine over to the left and the right in the picture as a whole, you've got the lungs. Number 5 shows the red vessels that are sort of peeking out from behind, and those are the pulmonary veins. And I'm sorry, did I misspeak before? I might have. I can't remember what I said, but number 4, those are the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so 3 is the pulmonary trunk. Then we're going to the pulmonary arteries. We're moving away from the heart to the lungs. The blood picks up oxygen in the lungs, and so we're returning to the heart via the number 5 vessels, and those are the pulmonary veins. And notice we're back to red because now the blood has oxygen in it. You can't really see exactly where they're coming in because they're in the back there, but both the left and right pulmonary veins will be emptying blood into the left atrium, which is number 6. Okay, so that's the top chamber on the left. Then we're going to go through a bicuspid valve into the largest chamber in the heart, which is the left ventricle. That's number 7. And then, I don't know if you can tell what's going on here in the picture, but the aorta, which is number 8, is kind of behind that pulmonary trunk. Okay, so number 7 goes up and to the left, that arrow, and so that's now this blood is being pumped out to systemic circulation. You'll notice there's another valve right below the number 8. That's the aortic semilunar valve, and then you get to the aorta. Now the aorta does a little kind of loop around. If you look at the top of the aorta, that's known as the aortic arch. Okay, but because it actually does kind of make almost a U-turn, and it comes back down, goes all the way down into the abdomen, and it continues on as the abdominal aorta, and then there are a number of large blood vessels that start to come off of that to feed the different organs. There are 3 vessels coming off of the aortic arch in the top. You'll become familiar with those when you go over the heart model, but those are going to be some of the major vessels going up the neck into the head region. If you've ever heard of the carotid arteries, those are going to be, a couple branches of those are going to be coming off of the aorta either directly or indirectly. I want to take just a quick look at the cardiac muscle cells because this is what's going to make up the bulk of the wall of the heart. And we talked a little bit about cardiac muscle. I think we identified visually the cardiac muscle cells. One of the features of the cardiac muscle cells and kind of what set them apart from smooth and skeletal muscle were the intercalated discs, which you can kind of see a little micrograph down there on the right-hand side. But these are special contacts between the cells that allow basically ions to move back and forth pretty freely from one cell to the next. And that is how the electrical signals spread amongst all of the cardiac muscle cells and really allow them to kind of behave as a unit, right? Because there's a very coordinated contraction that takes place when it comes to the heart muscle. So all of those cells have to be in sync with one another, whether they're contracting or whether they're relaxing. So these intercalated discs are where that communication is able to take place. While we're talking about the electrical signals that run through the heart, if we kind of look at, again, an overview of the heart itself, so we have an internal view like we did before, we can see the direction in which those electrical signals move through the heart muscle really as an entire layer. There's something called the cardiac conducting system, which consists of a few structures and specialized groups of cells within the heart. Part of the conducting system includes 2 nodes that occur in the wall of the right atrium. That's what that RA is, right atrium. So you want to look in the picture at the top chamber in blue. And it also includes something called the conducting bundle, which is kind of where those yellow fibers are penetrating. Those are all parts of the conducting bundle. The 2 nodes in the heart are the sinoatrial node, which is known as the pacemaker of the heart, and the other one is the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. They're both located in the right atrium. The sinoatrial node is the one that's a little bit higher up, and the reason it's called the pacemaker is because this is the node that really is responsible for initiating the electrical signals and therefore the contraction of the heart. And so if you have a normally functioning sinoatrial node, generally you're going to see an average heart rate of about 70 to 80 beats per minute. The atrioventricular node, on the other hand, which is a little bit lower, is going to be the second structure to receive those electrical signals. So we're kind of looking at the actual chronology of how the electricity moves. So you get the SA node at the top, then the AV node, and then from the AV node, which is on the bottom portion of that right atrium, you'll follow the yellow lines to the AV bundle, which is the kind of just that single line coming off of the AV node. And then that bundle, right down the middle of that heart, is those are the left and the right bundle branches. Okay, and then those kind of go all the way down what's called the septum of the heart. It's another term you'll learn later. And then they make a little bit of a turn upwards and penetrate the rest of that muscle layer. So when you're looking at the heart, kind of that area that you see in the light pink, most of which is covered by the yellow pathway of the conducting system, that's all the muscle layer. Those are where the cardiac muscle cells are located. So the heart, the bulk of the thickness of the heart is made of the cardiac muscle cells. And so kind of towards the bottom of the heart, not the very, very tip, but maybe even a little bit higher, you can see where the leader lines are specialized cells called Purkinje fibers. And all I'm going to say really about that is they're kind of like enhanced cardiac muscle cells. So they have the action potentials and the signals, the electrical signals, really kind of speed up and happen a little bit faster once we get to those fibers, so that the signals can spread pretty rapidly throughout the entire layer of heart muscle. This is something that we covered back with muscles and actually neurons, and we're not going to do the whole action potential thing all over again, but I just want to do a quick, more general comparison of the nerve signal as it occurs in, let's say, a skeletal muscle cell versus cardiac muscle, and just kind of point out a couple key differences here. So on the left-hand side, hopefully if you remember our coverage of the action potential, it's that graph that shows the depolarization and the repolarization, and it's a pretty quick process. And if you look at the time scales down at the bottom, you can see that we're talking in terms of milliseconds, so very quick periods of time. And the cardiac muscle potential is shown over to the right. And I think probably one of the biggest differences just in the general shape of the graphs is you've got this really sharp peak in the skeletal muscle on the left, and in the cardiac muscle, at least the top portion where you hit the peak voltage, it seems to kind of be a little bit more drawn out. Okay, there's actually there's a plateau, there's a little bit of a leveling out, and what that's telling us overall is about the speed at which these signals are taking place. In cardiac muscle cells, the action potentials are longer in duration. Now again, we're still talking milliseconds here, so it's still a pretty short amount of time and not anything that we'd even be able to, measure on any level. But if you look at my comparison numbers there, in cardiac muscle cells, you're looking at the signal lasting anywhere from 200 to 500 milliseconds versus less than 2 milliseconds in skeletal muscle. Okay, there's just not the need for cardiac muscle to react as quickly. Okay, it's not that kind of muscle, and that's not what the heart is for. As long as it maintains its the rhythm and the contraction pattern, then that's all we need it to do. This is something that some of you may be familiar with, and a lot of times I'll have students who work in a cardiologist's office, and they're very familiar with the electrocardiogram, otherwise known as an EKG or an ECG. And with the electrocardiogram, what this is showing us is kind of an overall summary of what is happening in the heart as far as the electrical activity. And this is where some of those terms from before are going to come up, things like depolarization and repolarization. So I just want to give you sort of a brief explanation about how to read these things if you are not already familiar, and what those little peaks and valleys and what the different waves actually mean. So the electrocardiogram is it's measuring the sum total of all of the electricity or all of the electrical signals that are taking place in the heart. The waves, there are 3 waves. We have the P wave, which you'll see in green. We have that really spiky red wave in the middle, the QRS, and then there's a blue T wave to the right. So those are the waves. Now the waves do not directly correspond with the contraction and the relaxation of the heart. When I say contraction and relaxation, it's like you can imagine the heart being a muscle, and when it contracts, it squeezes, and when it squeezes, it's going to squeeze blood out. When it relaxes, it does just that. The chambers kind of get a little bit bigger, and it just sort of resets itself. The waves themselves are not indicating those events specifically. What they are doing is they're predicting them in a way. And so the P wave, for example, if you look at my descriptions on the left, the P wave, during the P wave, we have depolarization of the atria, the two top chambers of the heart. Okay, now depolarization, that goes back to our neurons, where really it just means that sodium ions are coming in, and the membrane potential of those cells is increasing. Now, the relationship between the electrical events is what I like to call them. So depolarization and repolarization would be electrical events. The connection between those and the actual contraction or relaxation of the heart is that the electrical activity immediately precedes the mechanical workings of the heart, okay, the contraction or the relaxation. So right before a portion of the heart contracts, for example, it will depolarize. Right before a portion of the heart relaxes, it will repolarize. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through the descriptions. So the P wave is showing the point at which the atria are depolarizing, and what that corresponds to as far as what the heart itself is doing. You can see what I have written there right before the atria contract. Notice I'm not saying that the atria are contracting right then and there. That happens right before. So in fact, the contraction of the atria and the relaxation, they're going to fall like right in between these waves. They're going to fall into these little ranges. They actually call them intervals, but I'm not going to go that far into the detail of the electrocardiogram. The QRS waves, which are you can see it's very dramatic spike in membrane potential. That's because the ventricles are depolarizing during that time. And the ventricles are the larger chambers in the heart, so it comes out more dramatically in the EKG. Also, what's taking place here is the repolarization of the atria, okay, because the repolarization, if you go back to the potential itself, depolarization is when you have the uphill climb, but then you eventually have to come back down. So if you depolarize, you always have to repolarize later, or right after that. So the atria depolarize during the P wave. The ventricles depolarize during the QRS, but that also, within that little range during that wave, we also have the repolarization of the atria. So they're coming back down. But the actual QRS wave is really just, all we really see there is ventricular depolarization because it's so dramatic. And again, in bold, you'll see that both of these things happening right before the ventricles contract. Okay, so the depolarization of the atria precedes contraction of the atria, and the depolarization of the ventricles precedes contraction of the ventricles. So in the T wave, what we have left to do then is to have the ventricles repolarize. So that's what's happening there. You can see it's a little bit bigger wave than the P, but not quite as big as the QRS. And the repolarization of the ventricles occurs right before the ventricles relax. The next few slides are going to take us through the cardiac cycle, which is basically a heartbeat. It's a contraction relaxation cycle, and we're going to follow what's happening in the heart, what the different components of the heart are doing, where the blood's going, and there are basically 4 stages to this cardiac cycle. So, like I said, think of this as one heartbeat, which, probably about 3 of them just went by in the time it took me to say that. But we're going to slow this down so we can really, look at each part individually. So from the onset of the ventricular contraction to the beginning of the next is a heartbeat, otherwise known as the cardiac cycle. We can think of the heart as being two separate pumps. There's a right half and a left half, and we kind of saw that before in when we were following the route of blood. Because the right side of the heart is getting ready to send blood to the lungs, and it's the left side of the heart's job to send the blood to the rest of the body. And so these heartbeats consist of repetitive cycles of contraction, which is known as systole. You should know these terms in blue, and relaxation, diastole, of the heart chambers. So it's a contraction and a relaxation, a squeezing and a relaxing, a squeezing and a relaxing. One of the things to kind of keep in mind, and this is going to actually come up in other chapters too, because it doesn't just apply to blood flow, but when we're looking at the blood flow in relation to what the heart is doing, blood moves from areas of higher to lower pressure. Okay, there's a pressure gradient that is created by the heart. When the heart contracts, pressure goes up because everything is kind of squeezing together. When the heart relaxes, pressure goes down. Okay, and so while the heart, when we think of it as a pump, yes, it's true that it's squeezing and it's, physically forcing blood in different directions. Some of that, a good portion of the blood flow is due to the fact that the heart is creating these different areas of pressure. It's creating these areas of high pressure and low pressure so that the blood itself can move down that gradient. Okay, can use that difference in pressure to actually flow in one direction or another. A normal cardiac cycle is about 0.7 to 0.8 seconds in duration. It's a little bit higher in athletes and a little bit lower in infants. So the next two slides are going to take us through the different stages of the cardiac cycle. And one of the things that'll be significant here are the actual names of the stages, because they're actually very descriptive. If you think about what they mean, it tells you a lot about what's going on in there. So the first two stages of the cardiac cycle have to do with systole. Okay, so that's going to be when the heart is contracting. Okay, and we're actually going to be looking at this from the point of view of the ventricles. So you'll see the two pictures of the heart. Take a look at the one on the left first when everything is kind of relaxed. And so the ventricles are going to be those two larger chambers on the bottom. So the first stage relating to systole is called isovolumic contraction. So two words there that describe the state of the heart. First of all, contraction. So we know that the heart is contracting at this point. Okay, and when the heart contracts, if you picture the heart kind of squeezing together a little bit, what contraction is going to accomplish as far as the look of the heart is the chambers of the heart, the spaces within the heart, when the heart contracts, they get smaller, okay, because everything is kind of squeezing together. So keep that in mind. Contraction decreases the volume of the chambers inside of the heart. And in this case, again, it's the ventricles that we're talking about. Now, isovolumic, that term means same volume. Okay, and that's going to relate to the amount of blood that's contained within the heart at this point. So let's take a look at what's going on. So the ventricles contract and their volume gets smaller. So the actual size of the space of the ventricles gets smaller. Now, if we assume that, there's blood contained within these ventricles, if the space of the ventricles is getting smaller, but the amount of blood that's contained within the ventricles hasn't changed any, that increases the pressure in the ventricles. Okay, it's like anything. If you have people in a room, okay, you have 25 people in a room, and the room is such and such a size, and then you take those 25 people and you try to squeeze them into a smaller room, the pressure has increased. Okay, and so really what's going to happen here is that the chambers of the heart are going to be changing size depending upon whether we're contracting or relaxing. And that's going to, in turn, change the pressure inside of those chambers. So pressure and volume are inversely related. Means that as one goes up, the other goes down, or the other way around. And not only are they just related in that way, but there's a causal relationship between the two, which means that volume changes lead to pressure changes, but not the other way around. Okay, it would be incorrect to say that the pressure inside the ventricles increases, therefore the volume decreases. It's the volume decreases, therefore the pressure increases. Okay, so volume always has to come first, and it's the action of the heart that is creating those volume changes, and then subsequently the pressure changes. All right, so the other thing that we have underneath isovolumic contraction is the state of the valves. Okay, so the AV valves are the ones that separate the atria from the ventricles, and the semilunars are the valves that are leading into both the pulmonary and the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. All of the valves at this point in time during isovolumic contraction are closed. Now here's the significance of that. The heart is contracting, okay, and so we see that, there are volume changes, there are pressure changes taking place. And anytime there is a pressure difference and blood has an opportunity to flow, it will do so. Okay, and as in the previous slide I described, blood flows from higher to lower pressure, always. But the deal now, though, is at this particular stage, all of the valves in the heart are closed. So even though there may be a pressure gradient that potentially blood could move down, it can't go anywhere. Okay, it's like closing all the doors of a building. All right, it doesn't matter if people want to get out, they can't, because all of the doors are closed. And so even though the blood might otherwise have an opportunity to follow the pressure gradient, it cannot do so because all the valves are closed. Therefore, there is no blood flow out of the heart. That's where the isovolumic comes in. It means that the volume of blood inside of the heart stays the same because nothing is leaving. Okay, so in number 2, we have also systole, so the heart continues to contract. If you look at the right-hand picture, you'll kind of get a feel for what I mean by squeezing those ventricles. Okay, see how the ventricles, the size of the ventricles has gotten a little bit smaller in the picture on the right because those muscle cells are contracting. And now we have the period of ejection. Okay, it's not isovolumic anymore because let's take a look at what's different here just by the description. So the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and aorta. Okay, those are the two big vessels, the big blue one in the front and the big red one that leads to the arch. Okay, and so because of the squeezing of the ventricles and the decrease in volume, what that's done is it's increased the pressure quite a bit in those chambers, and that pressure becomes greater than the pressure in both of the vessels. Okay, those are going to be the exit points for the blood. So now we have a high pressure inside the ventricles, low pressure inside the pulmonary trunk and aorta situation. High pressure to low pressure. Blood's going to go in that direction, okay, from ventricles to both of those major arteries. Before, it could not do that because those valves were closed, but look at what happens now. During the ejection period, the semilunar valves open up. Therefore, the blood is able to leave. Okay, that's why it's called ejection. Again, a very descriptive term because the blood is being ejected out of the heart. The next 2 phases of the cardiac cycle are diastole phases. So this is going to be the heart in relaxation mode. And you can see we have the kind of the more contracted looking heart on the left and then the more relaxed heart on the right. And you'll see that there's a kind of a correspondence to some of the titles here. So in number 3 we have diastole. This is called isovolumic relaxation. So here we have that idea of isovolumic once again. Okay, so let's see what's going on. Well, relaxation tells us straight out that the ventricles are relaxing. Okay, so the ventricles are going to go from the smaller size, and relaxation of the ventricles is going to cause now the volume within the chambers to increase. So the chambers are going to get bigger again. Okay, it's like it's alleviating, some of the pressure there. So when the volume gets bigger, that means that the pressure goes down. All right, so then you can see that in the heart on the right. All right, the ventricles are back to their kind of starting size, if you will, and so there's lower pressure now in those ventricles. Once again, all of the valves are closed. Notice that in both isovolumic stages, all valves are closed. And that's directly related to the reason why it's isovolumic, because when the valves are closed, that blood is not going anywhere. So the blood is not leaving the heart. Therefore, the total volume of blood inside of the heart remains the same. Okay, in number 4, we're still in diastole, and now what we're doing is we're allowing the heart to essentially refill. It has just squeezed a whole bunch of blood out. The right side of the heart has squeezed that blood out to the lungs, and the left side of the heart has squeezed the blood out into systemic or body circulation. Now the heart's going to fill up again with blood so it can start the next cardiac cycle and do the same thing. So that's where we get to the passive and active ventricular filling. So it kind of comes in 2 stages again. Picture the ventricles continuing to relax. And so now the ventricular pressure, the pressure in the ventricles is dropping. The blood that will fill the ventricles will come eventually from the atria. Okay, so these are going to be kind of our 2 areas of interest right now. Because the ventricular pressure is now so low due to the relaxation, it creates a pressure gradient in relation to the atria. The pressure in the atria becomes greater than, that's the little first bullet point that I have there under number 4. Pressure in the atria becomes greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So once again, we have this high pressure, low pressure situation. The high pressure is in the atria, the 2 top chambers, and the low pressure is in the ventricles, the 2 bottom chambers. Because this is the filling stage, you'll notice that the AV valves now are open. Those are the valves that separate the atria and the ventricles on both sides. Therefore, since we have high pressure in the atria, low pressure in the ventricles, the blood is able to flow from the atria into the ventricles, since the valves are open. Now this is called passive ventricular filling, what I just described, the blood simply using that pressure gradient, that pressure difference to go from one area to another. And about 70% of the filling is accomplished that way. But towards the end of that passive filling, the sinoatrial node, okay, our pacemaker, is going to spontaneously depolarize and start the cycle of contraction again. The cycle of contraction will begin in the atria, okay? And so the atria will contract and, in a sense, squeeze that little bit of blood that has not yet gotten there into the ventricles and will complete the filling process. Okay, so most of the blood flow is going to be somewhat passive, just allowing the blood to go from an area of high to low pressure from atria to ventricle. But then at the very end, those atria give one last squeeze, get that blood out of there, get it into the ventricles, and now we're loaded up for the next cardiac cycle. Okay, because what we'll go back to at this point then is step number 1 in the previous slide. Okay, those ventricles will then contract. We'll go through the period of isovolumic contraction, ejection, then those ventricles will relax and refill, and then we'll be back to 3 and 4, And it's a cycle, so it keeps going round and round. So to wrap us up here, I just wanted to, sometimes I like to throw in a little FYI type of thing, and just some specifics as far as what happens to the heart as we get older. We talked about things like, valves. It is a muscle. Okay, so some of the things to be aware of. There are some gradual changes in heart function that occur, but usually these changes that are just due to age, unless there's some kind of real issue with the heart, are pretty minor under just normal resting conditions, where we really kind of see the stress and the strain that might be a little bit more of an issue is during periods of exercise when we're really stressing our heart and kind of pushing it to its max. Another thing we might see over time is hypertrophy of the left ventricle. Hypertrophy means enlargement, and it's really because the left ventricle is working harder, and the effectiveness of the blood flow, whether it be due to deterioration of vessels or something in the heart itself, the effectiveness of the pumping of the heart just isn't what it was before. And so basically the left ventricle has to work a little harder to get the same amount of blood flow going. Our maximum heart rate usually decreases. There's a tendency for valves to start functioning abnormally. We may see arrhythmias, which are just different patterns of contraction and relaxation that are not the norm. Okay, the cardiac cycle that we just went through. And then increased consumption of oxygen that's required to pump the same amount of blood. So the heart itself may actually require more energy in order to still give the same level of output as it had been doing. So we have the questions, so you can kind of use these as a guide to get you through the chapter. I will say that cardiac cycle, it's kind of a little bit of a detailed part of this chapter, and so there will definitely be some questions on the exam about those. I don't know if I've really talked to you guys yet about the exams themselves, but we just had one before break. But I will tell you that my plan is to kind of convert the exams. Well, they're going to be online, of course, but I'm going to convert those exams to mostly multiple choice. I would say at most there would be one or two very short written questions, if at all. I haven't really gotten there yet, but so it'll be a little bit of a different a type of assessment. We will see you for chapter 13, where we'll wrap up our coverage of cardiovascular and look kind of beyond the heart at the peripheral circulation. See you next time.